Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 12th Annual Kraft Lecture. My name is Derek Bruin and I'm head of the Department of Agribusiness and Agricultural Economics at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Science here at the University of Manitoba. The title of this year's Kraft Lecture is Capturing Policy and Rent-Seeking and Unintended Consequences in Food and Agricultural Policy. Before sharing further details of the lecture, I would first like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 12th annual lecture. We began the annual Kraft Lecture. We began this lecture series in 2009 with the inaugural lecture of Dr. Alice McCalla from the University of California, Davis, to pay tribute to the memory and professional contributions of Dr. Daryl Kraft, a former professor and department head of our department. Since then, we've had 11 lectures by some of the most outstanding economists in our profession. The chronology of these lectures is on our department website, and most of them were saved as files that you can still watch. We thank all of these previous Kraft lectures and the enormous contribution they've made to the lecture series. Many in the audience are very familiar with Dr. Kraft and his contributions to our profession, to his students, to his family, and to our society in general. However, some in the audience may not be familiar with Dr. Kraft and those contributions. I would now like to introduce to you Dr. Brian Olson, a friend of Daryl's and previous department head, who will provide you an overview of Daryl Kraft, the person and the professional. As well, he will provide you with some background on this lecture series and how it came about and why it means so much to Daryl's family and those of us who worked with and were touched by this unique human being, Dr. Daryl Kraft. Brian. You're muted, Brian.
I always have one student in class who quickly reminds me. Hi, I'm Brian Olson, and I have a very simple job today to answer two questions. What is the Kraft Lecture and Endowment, and who is Daryl Kraft? And I'll answer them both shortly to begin with. Daryl was a long-term member of the Department of Agribusiness and Agricultural Economics, a department head for a significant part of that. He joined the department in 1973, and he remained with the department until his passing in 2003. In the following years, family and colleagues, friends established an endowment trust fund in the memory of Daryl, of this incredible individual, and that it would symbolize a couple things. One, and they are things that Daryl held very near and dear. One was that it be sort of emphasize sound and competent education. And the second was that it be focused on prudent public agriculture policy. And that was sort of the framework that we started with. I'd like to just give you a quick picture I have in my mind of Daryl. Daryl was a great teacher. Also, everyone, whether it's industry, University of Manitoba, government, they like talking and brainstorming. He got a lot of Daryl agriculture policy. I see Alan Dawson is on the line, and he certainly was one of those individuals that Daryl would bring into the classroom through his articles. And I was like the typical phoning Daryl and brainstorming about what my ideas were on agriculture policy and so on. I was in industry or government at the time. And my typical phone call, I'd be chatting with Daryl. And after 20 minutes, suddenly Daryl would say, Brian, I gotta go. I'm 5 minutes late for my class, gotta go. And so there'd be a rush goodbye. And I would imagine Daryl rushing off to class with some articles stuck in his shirt pocket they'd be on the crow's nest pass rate or the CWB debate or feed grain policy or farm income safety proposals. And he'd rush into that classroom and enthusiastically start talking about one of those subjects. And that enthusiasm was contagious. The students would just sort of see that, immediately gravitate towards and start taking notes and listening to Daryl. And that was Daryl. And that's just sort of a memory that I have of Daryl in the classroom, or at least my imagination of Daryl in the classroom. And a little background on Daryl briefly. Daryl grew up on a family cattle ranch nearby Medicine Hat, Alberta, where he attended later on Mount Royal College in Calgary on a football scholarship. Daryl was a person of many talents. He then finished his honors bachelor degree at the University of Manitoba and then went on to do a PhD in agricultural economics at Washington State University. Daryl was a great guy, always interested, always interesting, and most important, and really most important to Daryl, was that he was a wonderful family man. He was soulmate to his wonderful wife, Myrna, the dearest friend and mentor to his son, Dan. And if I stopped there, I'm sure Daryl would just be fine with that. You know, that he was a wonderful family man, that was the most important. But Daryl left his mark in many other areas and many other places. And I'd like to touch on a few of those. First, in the department, he really was everything that I imagine a good professor to be. He was a leader. He was a very quiet leader. He was engaging, always interested, always interesting, very active, polite, always polite, debating but not argumentative. In a single word, Daryl symbolized the word we often use in university, collegial. Daryl was collegial. And secondly, he was highly regarded as a teacher, as my earlier story suggests. And he liked to highlight the classes often with the policy debate and discussion. And he was quite well known for that among students and professors. And third, Daryl was a policy expert in many areas. I've sort of mentioned them: the transportation rate discussions, marketing structures, farm income stabilization support, crop insurance, and so on. And his knowledge and research made him a valuable advisor to farmers, industry, province, and federal governments. Now, I could continue with those traits and accomplishments, but it's really easy to summarize. Daryl was simply a very competent individual and a nice guy, really nice guy. It was a pleasure to have him in your family, as a friend, or as a colleague. He will be missed. He has been missed. And to honor Daryl, thanks to family and friends, especially wife Myrna and son Danny, an endowment fund was created. It has three arms that I'll mention, that allows individuals to contribute to three activities: this undergraduate award, a graduate award, a graduate fellowship, and then this annual Kraft Lecture. So, oh yes, and like on a PBS commercial, please be quite interested in becoming a contributor and a supporter. Go to the department website for details. So thanks to the Kraft family and others for these efforts. And these efforts have led us to where we are today, this 12th Daryl F. Kraft Lecture. And our newest inductee to that list of names is going to be added today as a Kraft Lecture. All of those on the list, as Derek earlier mentioned, are top names in our profession. I'm really proud of the people that we have managed to have as a Kraft Lecture. And up until this one, they've all been live lectures where they were flown in from various spots in Canada and the United States. And so we're very proud of that. The lectures have been excellent, always topical, always current. And so I'll turn you back to our Master of Ceremonies, Derek Roon, to the 12th and the newest Kraft Lecture, Ryan Cardwell.
Thank you, Brian. It was always a wonderful thing to listen to Dr. Kraft talk about policy, but we have another interesting person willing to talk about policy today. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Ryan Cardwell, as the speaker of the 12th Kraft Lecture. He's the first faculty still working at the University of Manitoba to deliver the lecture, although Dr. Colin Carter was an alumni of our department and is a past lecture presenter. Ryan's from Saskatoon. He holds a BA in economics with honors from the University of Saskatchewan and an MA in economics from the University of British Columbia. He also has received his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Saskatchewan in 2005. Between his MA and his PhD, he worked for economy.com/Moody's Analytics. He began his work at the University of Manitoba after his PhD in 2005 with a focus on trade and food aid. In 2020, he was awarded the Community Outreach Award from the University of Manitoba. Part of that citation included his efforts in exploring the implications of the COVID pandemic on our sector through a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics, which he co-edited. Dr. Cardwell is an award-winning teacher of agricultural policy. He teaches at the diploma, degree, and graduate levels, a thing that Dr. Kraft had done too. And today we're asking him to discuss some of the implications of his research regarding the nature of rent-seeking and unintended consequences in agriculture and food policies. This is an area he's explored from many angles, with highly cited articles related to food aid, trade policy, trade agreements, and domestic support. And much of his research explores the implications of these policies for stakeholders up and down the supply chain, from the farmer to the consumer, from regulators to trading partners, again, something that Daryl himself would often do. So I'm looking forward to what he has to say today. I imagine you are too. So I'll end my introduction with a thank you to Ryan for accepting our request to deliver the 12th annual Daryl Kraft Lecture.
All right, so I guess that's over to me now. Thank you, Derek, for that nice introduction. And thanks very much to Brian and Derek and the Kraft family for inviting me. I've been involved with the Kraft Fellowship for many years in helping select the winner of the Policy Paper Prize and the Graduate Fellowship. And actually the inaugural winner of the Policy Paper Prize was an undergrad of ours who is now a Deputy Director at Agriculture Canada. So we've had some really great students go through that program. And of course, I've enjoyed coming to these lectures over the years, often presented by professors that I studied as a student and now are my colleagues. So it's really flattering and nice to be part of this tradition. So thank you for that. And I hope this is the first and last version of this lecture that takes place online. And just on a personal note about Daryl, so I actually didn't have the opportunity to meet Daryl, but just a personal story that kind of reflects how I think of him in my imagination is when I started at U of M, we had a colleague in our department named James Rood, who was a professor and became a friend of mine and many of our colleagues. And I remember James, he had the office next to mine and he had a chalkboard in his office. And on this chalkboard in one corner, he had a model drawn up, a graphical model that he and Daryl had been working on some years before and before I had arrived. And James was very particular that this never be erased, right? He wanted that to stay. And, those of us that are friends with James know that, he can sometimes come off as kind of prickly. So, it's a testament for Daryl to get into his heart and make James sentimental about something means it's quite a statement. It says something, Daryl was doing something right. So that's kind of how his picture was developed in my mind. So with that, I'm going to move on to my talk. So as mentioned, the title is Capturing Policy, Rent-Seeking and Unintended Consequences. So what I'm going to do today is introduce through the first half, perhaps, some concepts that I think are very important in understanding agricultural policy, concepts that have helped me understand and research and that I use a lot in my teaching and my research. And then I will discuss how a lot of my work has followed through those veins of rent-seeking and unintended consequences. And then at the end, I'll try and draw out some policy conclusions and lessons that hopefully will be interesting and useful. So first, this concept called rent-seeking. This is a phrase that economists use a lot. It's in the title of a book that I use in some of my courses, and it's a chapter title in another book I use in some of my courses. So it's an important concept that we use and we teach a lot in our courses at all levels. As Derek mentioned, I teach at diploma, graduate, and undergraduate levels, and I emphasize these concepts in all of them. So what does rent seeking actually mean? Well, so the definition of rent seeking really is an attempt to influence the rulemaking process. So legislation, subsidies, things like that, in an effort to obtain more favorable market outcomes. So those can be in the form of higher prices, limits on competition, higher subsidies. And really the idea is to increase your share, if you're the rent seeker, your share of the economic surplus. So again, this is a jargony word, surplus, that economists use a lot. And as I told Derek before this started, he saw this slide. I'm only going to have one slide with supply and demand graphs on it. It'll be very simple and quick. But just for the purposes of illustration, what do economists mean when we say this phrase economic surplus? So, this is a downward sloping demand function. It represents how much consumers are willing to pay, and an upward sloping supply function, the price or the quantity that producers will bring to market at different prices. So this is sort of a stripped down, bare bones, basic model that we use in teaching for just a competitive market in equilibrium with a price and a quantity. So at this price and quantity, there are measurable benefits going to consumers because several consumers are buying this product at a price that is below their willingness to pay, right? So they are getting this product at a price of P, but they're actually willing to pay more. And same for producers, there's economic benefit to them as a result of participating in the market, because they are receiving a price above the minimum price required to bring it to market. So economists spend a lot of time in environments like this, thinking about how might changes in this market affect the benefits going to consumers, how might they affect the benefits going to producers. And we can incorporate governments, taxpayers, et cetera, in these kinds of models. So this is a simple model of just a basic competitive industry without any policy in it. But of course, policies shift these things around and change these curves and move them. So one example would be an industry where production is cartelized and controlled, and output is brought down below what would have occurred in an open market, right? So in that case, Q1 here would be below a competitive market equilibrium, and we would then have a higher price for this product. And what that does is it reallocates the benefits in the market between the market participants. So the consumers now face a higher price and buy less. The producers face a higher price and sell a little bit less. And we get a reallocation of these economic surplus measures. So the point I'm trying to make here is we spend a lot of our time working on models like this to try and sort out these changes as a result of a change in the market or a policy that changes the market. Okay. And almost all policies that we can think about will result in some reallocation, like I've illustrated here. Okay. So this is sort of the goal of rent seeking, is to try and increase your share of that. But what does rent seeking actually? Oh, and by the way, this is just an example of something that economists would spend their time doing. We may look at a policy, in this case, a change in chicken import tariffs, and how that might affect prices and quantities, and then how that would change those surplus measures. So, economists spend lots of time generating tables like this to try and answer these questions. So what does rent seeking actually look like? Well, it takes a number of forms. Probably the one that people typically think of and understand, and actually we know most about because we have data, is formal lobbying of elected officials, in this case in Ottawa. So this is a screen capture from the Registry of Lobbyists that the federal government keeps. You can go online and search this. So I've just done a search here for Pulse Canada. So a producer group representing pulse growers in Canada. And so this is showing 168 registered meetings between Pulse Canada lobbyists and elected MPs in Ottawa over a 12-month period. So that's sort of a steady voice in the ear of policymakers advocating in the interests of this producer group. So that's sort of formal rent seeking that most people would think of as lobbying. Equally important, but we don't really have data on these things, is sort of the behind the scenes unofficial lobbying activities that the producer groups and others undertake. So there's the sort of the cliched whining and dining of politicians that you see probably more of in the United States. And then, of course, there are a lot of behind the scene activities. I've got two images here that people probably remember. The Conservative Party of Canada's leadership campaign in 2018 in the news on several occasions was the discussed effect that the Dairy Farmers of Canada lobby might have had in who ended up becoming leader. And this was the briefing binder that the members had on the floor of the campaign. And then this is some stuff from the news. I'm sure many of you saw this picture at the time. But this is stuff that happens. It is very important in the setting of policies, but it's harder to observe. We don't really have data on this. There's also less traditional activities that try and shape the narrative around agricultural policies. So this often comes through the media, through popular press, in op-eds and interviews and PR statements. This is an example taken from early in the pandemic, when the government had announced in this case, $252 million to address food supply issues. There was a lot of uncertainty at the time. The CFA at the time, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, wasn't happy with that, called for significantly more funding to the tune of $2.6 billion. And you'll notice the language here that was used by the CFA is that this $2.6 billion would be used to address food security in Canada. Okay, now, that certainly raised a red flag for me. The idea that subsidizing farmers in a country like Canada is a way to address food insecurity is several decades out of date, but they know what they're doing. That's a great talking point. Who's against food security, right? So this is another way that this is done. Another way that rent seeking is done, and that from my personal perspective is becoming more concerning, is the presence of rent seekers in the academy. And by academy, I mean the university. So, this has been going on in many departments and disciplines for a long time, but we now have a number of these in my discipline. So these are, we know what to watch for in the other slides that I showed you. These are professional organizations, lobbyists, producer groups. They're doing what they're paid to do. That's their job. But we also now are encountering these funded chairs in university that on one level are sort of operating behind a veil of academic objectivity, and on the other hand, advocating for the commercial interests of the lobby groups that pay their salaries, sometimes even without acknowledging their source of funding, right? And acknowledging these potential serious conflicts of interest. Okay, and this has become a concern in a number of industries, in oil and gas. In Alberta, you hear these debates a lot, but it's becoming a concern. So maybe I'll skip over that. I know I'm going to try and stay under 45 minutes, so I might skip one or two things here. So ultimately, how do we think about the decision to seek rents? And how does a producer group, for example, decide how to allocate money between the various things on which they spend money? So these producer groups are responsible to their growers, right, who contribute funds through checkoffs and things like that, and they have to decide how to spend their funds. So a lot of that goes towards research and development, breeding and agrology and things like that, and research and extension activities with their producers as well. But a lot of it also goes to activities that would fit under that rent seeking and sort of lobbying banner. So this is just an example taken from expenditures from a Manitoba Growers Association. So how do we think about that? Well, this is a figure that allows us to sort of conceptualize that decision on how to spend producer group money in my example. So how might the Manitoba Soybean Growers Association decide on how to allocate their money between investment in this case, so things like R&D, extension services. And so what this shows is marginal profitability to the producers of investing. And this is the amount of spending, right? So as the amount of spending goes up, there are still profits being returned from that activity, but it declines as more money is spent. So this declining marginal profitability. But eventually there will also be returns to this producer group of spending money on lobbying, on rent seeking. And so, I've just drawn the line here. And at some point, the reward to that first dollar spent on lobbying by the producer group will exceed the marginal return of spending on R&D or on extension services, right? So one way that we can think about this spending decision and this allocation decision is sort of up to this point, the profitability of R&D and extension services is high enough that they will undertake that, beyond which actually it's more profitable to lobby and try and get returns in the form of policies that benefit, so subsidies, trade barriers, et cetera. Okay, so this is one way that we can think about conceptualizing this decision. Okay, so given what we've talked about on rent seeking, we can use that knowledge now to help us observe the state of the world and understand how we sort of got there. So what I've done here is I've just put a bar graph of tariff rates on different products in Canada. So these are current tariff rates. Import taxes is what a tariff is. So for men's shirt, it depends on the trading partner a bit, but for men's shirt, it's 18%. For bicycles, it's 13%. For wheat, it's 0% for most of our trading partners. And for butter, about 300%. So why have policymakers decided that this is how things should be? What is it that led to this state of affairs? Well, of course, we can't answer it with great precision, but one of the important underlying assumptions of economics and other social sciences is that people, in many of their personal and their professional decisions in life, they are motivated by self-interest and they respond to incentives, right? And so, believe it or not, policymakers and elected politicians are people. So we really shouldn't think of them any differently, right? We should think of policymakers as making decisions on policies that reflect their interests. Okay, and of course, one of the most important things in a policymaker and elected policymakers' objective function is being in office, being reelected. So when they're making decisions on policies, they are making a political calculation on the costs and benefits in terms of votes on whether this policy should be pursued or not. Okay, so there's a very large literature in political economy and economics that addresses these issues. These are sort of two classics from that field. This paper, Protection for Sale, it's an international trade paper from several years ago that has become very famous. And what these authors did is tried to explain the observed pattern of import tariffs, in this case in the United States, by modeling them against lobbying donations from producer groups, from industry groups. And this paper has been cited thousands of times and been applied in many, many locations. It's sort of a cynical way to view the policymaking process, but it turns out to be a fairly a good way to understand how we ended up where we are. Okay, so this is public choice theory. Okay, so rent-seeking public choice, that's sort of the first big picture concept I wanted to get through. The second one is what economists refer to as unintended consequences. So economists spend lots of time, of course, thinking about the effect of a policy on an intended outcome. So, a subsidy on farm income, for example. But we also spend a lot of time thinking about the effect of that policy on unintended consequences, on outcomes that weren't specifically targeted. Okay, and sometimes those can be as or even more important than the effect on the intended target of the policy. So I'm just going to provide an example from outside agriculture, just because I find this example makes the case very well. And so there's a policy in some jurisdictions in the United States called ban the box. So ban the box is legislation that prohibits prospective employers from asking in an application form, do you have a criminal record? Right? And the idea, the architects behind this policy thought that this would then reduce discrimination against people that had previous criminal convictions. Now, what the architects of this policy didn't count on, or maybe didn't foresee, is that a lot of these potential employers have implicit racial biases. And so after this policy was put into place, there were a lot of anecdotal reports of Black and Hispanic men being discriminated against in hiring decisions because these implicit racial biases were being projected onto applicants, thinking, well, I can't ask them this, so I'm just going to assume that they do and set them aside, right? And so, economists are, at least we think we're good at sort of modeling and measuring and estimating these behavioral responses with data. So this is from a recent paper in the United States that tried to estimate this. And what they did is they measured, after this policy went into place, what was the effect on the probability of employment for different groups of people. So the probability of employment for white men really didn't change, okay? But what they found was that the probability of employment, all else equal, for Black men fell significantly, okay? So this policy created very serious unintended consequences, right? Well-intentioned, serious unintended consequences, okay? So that's what I mean by unintended consequences. And a lot of my work and a lot of agricultural policy is as important unintended consequences. Okay, so one closer to production agriculture, this is a figure from a recent paper that in which the authors were thinking about the potential for new regulations on certain pesticides. So over time, you can see this red line here represents the increased use of neonic pesticides in corn production in the United States, and it's just exploded. And as it has gone up so much, the use of other pesticides, older ones, have gone down. So this has come potentially at the expense of toxicity for honeybees. So as new regulations have been discussed on restricting the use of these neonic pesticides, what these authors did is tried to quantify what the farmer behavioral response might be to these two new restrictions, showing that, well, if these neonic pesticides are banned or restricted, farmers will likely go back to and substitute through some of these other pesticides. And of course, there will be consequences of that as well. So that would be like an unintended consequence of a new regulation on this other kind of pesticide. So this is the kind of thing that a lot of agricultural economists think about, how a policy might have these unintended consequences. Okay. Another set of unintended consequences that have been important in my work and in agricultural policy, I think more broadly, are distributional effects. So a distributional effect means that resources are being transferred from one group to another, dollars in some form usually. And that can be from one industry to another, or one region to another, or from consumers to producers, or from one income group to another, right? From either high income groups to low incomes, or low to high. So this figure shows average tax rates for Canadian taxpayers in different income groups. So the bottom 50th percentile of Canadians pay an average tax rate of, I don't know, what would this be? Low, quite low, under 10%, right? And as the incomes go up, as you go across this axis horizontally, income is going up. So in the higher income groups, the average tax rate paid is higher, right? It's an upward sloping line. So by design, income taxes in Canada are progressive, right? They impose a relatively higher tax rate or burden on high income households than low income households, okay? Of course, there are other policies that do the opposite, right? So a regressive policy would do the opposite. That would impose a higher burden on low income households than on high income households. So the GST, everyone's familiar with the GST. This is a revenue tool for the federal government, accounts for about 12% of government revenue. And in this case, we show a downward sloping line. So low income households typically spend a larger share of their income as opposed to save. So they are more affected by the GST. So low income households in the lowest income decile, so the poorest tenth of households, pay almost 4% of their incomes in GST. The richest decile, the top 10th, pay about 2% of their incomes in GST. And this curve slopes down. So this would be regressive. So this would be an unintentional regressive distributional policy. Okay. Carbon taxes, similar. So this shows the burden, in this case of Saskatchewan, from a paper at the University of Calgary that shows this similar concept. The burden of a carbon tax in Saskatchewan, given the makeup of their industry and tax structure, would be about 4% of incomes for the poorest tenth, that bottom decile, compared to less than 1% for the richest decile. So both of these policies with different targets. So the target of a carbon tax is not redistribution or raising money, it's reducing greenhouse gases. But in this case, it would have unintended consequences of being regressive, okay, among the taxpayers. Okay, so this is an important set of consequences that have played an important role in my research and in agricultural policy that I will talk about. So those are sort of the two big concepts that I wanted to introduce, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about now plays off of those concepts. So, as Derek mentioned, most of my training was in economics departments, and my first real introduction to the sort of the nitty-gritty and the sausage factory that was agricultural policy was when I was assigned to teach these courses when I arrived at U of M 16 and a half years ago, I guess. And so I was teaching and learning about these policies that did these things that to an outsider seemed strange, right? So as I'll talk about these in a few minutes, but for example, diverting Canada's foreign aid budget to domestic interest groups, right? Policies that pay farmers to take land out of cultivation, right? Pay them not produce. And the government authorizing and sanctioning the cartelization of staple food production. And then, of course, important regressive consequences among a lot of these policies as well. So, in my teaching, what I wanted to do is and in my research is get a better understanding of what are the incentives of all the actors related to these policies. So consumers, not just producers. When I get called by the press or the government, they always want to talk about what's the effect on producers. But of course, producers are just but one group in the whole system here. So there's consumers, there's taxpayers, there's politicians trying to get reelected, there's aid recipients, which I will focus on for part of today, and there's voters. So there's all kinds of people that we need to consider. What are the institutions and the trade rules and things in which these rules are made? And then, of course, we need to figure out how to quantify these effects and then translate them into policy lessons that we can communicate with government and with NGOs and with other groups. Okay, so this is what I've tried to do in my career. And what I'm going to do now is spend some time going through how these concepts have shaped my research and my teaching and graduate student supervision and my extension work. I've tried to do a lot of extension work as well. And I'll draw with some examples from some research I have done. So first, I'm going to talk about international food assistance. So this is something I've been working on in various areas for a number of years. But just to give you some background for those of you that aren't familiar with the world of food aid. So food aid traditionally, and this is what people typically, I think, still think of when they imagine food aid, is bulk commodities being, say, for example, wheat bought in Manitoba, put on a train, shipped to a port, put on a boat, sent to a recipient country, and then distributed in big packages, big bag that says gift of the USA or gift of Canada. And for a very long time, and for some donors, that is still the case. But the world has really changed in international food aid in recent years. And food aid delivery looks much more like this now. So typically, donor countries, with some important exceptions, now provide what we call cash-based food aid. So what that means is donors, including Canada, now no longer sends bags of wheat or bread at all to these recipient countries. Now what the Canadian government does is it provides cash. So that cash can be delivered directly to recipients through some intermediaries. And that can come, for example, in the form of a preloaded credit card or a voucher. This is a picture of a voucher that recipients would receive, and that can be redeemed for food in the recipient's local market. Okay. Or the donor country may provide funds to an implementing partner, and that partner might buy food in a neighboring country, right? And then deliver at a shorter distance. Okay. So this was an absolutely enormous change in the way food aid has been handled for the last 70 plus years. Okay. And it's really a story of agricultural policy and how agricultural policy historically influenced the world of food aid. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canadian experience and what happened in Canada to change this. So Canadian food aid policy started in the 1950s, formal food aid policy, and it really started as a response, as a response to a number of things, but providing food aid to initially former Commonwealth countries. And from the beginning, it always had multiple objectives that were explicitly stated by government. And I put a little red flag here. I'll come back to that. And anytime a policy claims to have multiple objectives, let that be a red flag to you. And I'll talk about that more towards the end. But food aid was used as a tool of foreign policy. So it was used to try and subsidize with in-kind food friendly governments in the Cold War, for example. So that was a very important stated policy objective of food aid. It was also used as a tool to subsidize domestic producers, so Canadian farmers whose products were being purchased and then delivered. And of course, what we all think of food aid is for, it was also used to address nutritional shortfalls of recipients in recipient countries. Okay. So the way this happened, the way that the mechanism that made this happen was through what we call tying restrictions. So food aid for a very long time was tied in that government donated funds had to be used by implementing agencies to buy Canadian produced and Canadian processed, mostly wheat at the beginning. Okay, so that kept a portion of that money going to interest groups in Canada. So this was done mostly for wheat for a number of years. But once other interest groups noticed what was going on, they recognized that the federal government was willing to divert some of the foreign aid budget to domestic interest groups. So they, put their hands in it and wanted some of that as well. So that the tying restrictions took on these very bizarre flavors, like there would be a regional flavor to it, right? There would be some fish, and there would be some dairy, and something called Canadian beef loaf, which was an actual aid product that the WFP was kind of forced to take. And these are, wildly inappropriate commodities to donate as food aid in a lot of cases. But those were the conditions placed on Canada donating at the time. Okay. And so there were a number of sort of back of the envelope attempts to quantify why this might cost more than would otherwise be the case. So this is a report from CETA, the International Development Agency, from a long time ago, in which they estimated they paid $200 million more for wheat from the wheat board than what the wheat board would have been charging its commercial customers, right? So what that means at the end of the day is less food is being bought for wheat or for recipients than would otherwise be the case. And actually here, this is a reference to a paper that Daryl Kraft co-authored. He was writing a review of the performance of the wheat board, and in that was documented these exact premiums, that the wheat board was charging a higher price to CETA for food aid than they were charging to many of their commercial customers. A similar story for dairy products from the CDC. This is an Auditor General report. Oh, and to make matters even more shocking is that there were also processing restrictions. So the wheat had to be bought in Canada and processed by Canadian firms. And at one point, these processing firms were actually accused and convicted in the end of fixing the prices, colluding and fixing the prices that they were charging CETA for these processed food aid commodities. So it was quite a complicated story, and what it led to was CETA, which had this envelope, this allocation in foreign aid funds, but they were having to defend it actively from these encroaching interests from domestic agricultural lobbies. Okay? So, if we're interested in using food aid as a tool to target malnutrition and emergencies, we have a lot of reasons to think that tying might be problematic and create a lot of unintended consequences. So one, of course, is that it becomes more expensive, right? You restrict the number of sellers, you almost necessarily increase the price. You also add unnecessary transportation and processing costs. It is also very slow, right? So you can imagine buying wheat in Manitoba and delivering it all the way to a recipient village inland in sub-Saharan Africa takes a long time. So, I've got some summary data here that I won't go through, but direct shipment of food aid from the United States, so buying it in the US and shipping it, can take many, many months, 150 days on average from this study, compared to buying it locally in the recipient region, maybe even in the village where the recipients are located, can just be a matter of a month or less. And the red bars are equivalent data for Canada. So it's much faster to buy it close, as you would expect. And that can be very important in emergencies. Dietary customs have been important in this consideration as well. So Canada really doesn't produce rice, for example, at a scale that led to surplus disposal through food aid. So we traditionally donated wheat. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, that's a big problem if the recipients who you are trying to address are not customarily wheat eaters, right? And it's not just a matter of being nice to meet their preferences. It has real significant nutritional and cost consequences. And another big issue that I won't really have time to get into is the local market effect. So, there were concerns, certainly, that if, for example, the United States, a big donor, delivered a huge quantity of in-kind wheat to a small local market, there's the potential for that to be a very significant supply shock that will push down local prices and create disincentives for local producers going forward. And of course, the opposite is possible too, that giving cash can push prices up. But these are considerations that are unintended consequences of trying to address food insecurity. Okay, so what happened in Canada? So for most of Canadian food aid history, there was, of course, a big imbalance of power between the interest groups that would want to tie and would want to untie. So those interested in maintaining tying were, of course, domestic lobbies that benefited from these high prices, and voicing for them was AAFC for many years. And on the other side, you have sort of like food aid recipients and local sellers who don't really have a strong voice in the setting of Canadian aid policies. So how did things change? Well, in 2004 was the Indian Ocean tsunami, and that affected primarily non-wheat eating people, right? So there was a lot of rice consumers who were particularly affected by this. And at the time, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, it's a Winnipeg-based private food aid charity that receives funding from the federal government to undertake a number of operations, including food aid. So at that time, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, led by their policy director at the time, who some of you might know, Stuart Clark, he's now retired, but he undertook a grassroots lobbying effort with stakeholders in this scene, including farmers and producer groups, aid agencies, SM academics, and he undertook a grassroots effort to try and change this, to try and convince the government to untie food aid from these restrictions. And actually, this was my first introduction to this topic. Stu called my then PhD supervisor to ask about some of the economics related to this. And so it's sort of been an interest of mine now for a long time. So anyway, he ran into a range of opinions. So the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association sided with this position. The CFA thought this was a good idea. The National Farmers Union resisted, did not want to untie. Pulse Canada did not want to untie. And of course, the big player, the elephant potentially in the room here for this debate, was the Canadian Wheat Board. So the Canadian Wheat Board probably, this is in my estimation, could have had the ability to at least delay, perhaps even derail any efforts to untie, but they basically stayed out of it. They were facing other existential issues at the time. Jim Cornelius, who was the president or the CEO of Food Grains Bank at the time, described it very nicely to me. He said, on the issue of untying, the Wheat Board was agnostic. So they just kind of stayed out of it. And as it turns out, the lobbying campaign, with the contribution of some academics and some workshops, did convince the federal government then in 2005 to reduce that tying rate to 50%. Okay, so what that meant is half of the donated money from the federal government could be used to buy food outside of Canada. So what happened? Well, this figure shows the share of food aid paid for by Canada that was bought in Canada up to this period. So it's, pardon me, almost everything, right? North of 90% in every year. Then this restriction was reduced to 50%. So within 2 years of that restriction changing, the agencies, so mostly the World Food Program and the Canadian Food Grains Bank, were buying half of their food outside of Canada. So this was, clearly a binding restriction on their activities. So in 2 years later, we had the world food price crisis, where commodity prices just exploded. And so the government at the time was faced with these food aid commitments that it had made previously that had become very expensive in the face of very high cereal prices. So they were more receptive to listening to ideas on, well, how can we still meet these commitments at a lower cost? And so ultimately, they entirely eliminated tying restrictions and removed them entirely. So again, after two years after that was changed and tying restrictions were entirely eliminated, donors now, in the case of wheat, buy no wheat in Canada. Or sorry, cereals, I should say cereals more broadly. So now the way this works is that the federal government gives money to these food aid agencies, again, most importantly, the World Food Program and the Food Grains Bank, and they then use that money to buy food, the food that they think is best suited to their operations in the location that is best suited to their operations. Okay, so this is how policy changed in Canada. And what we were interested in as researchers is, what did this mean on a number, how did this play out in a number of dimensions that we would be interested in? So this is a figure taken out of one of our papers that looks at the direction and the magnitude of food aid flows before and after the policy change. So in '88, food was still tied, and the direction of arrows show where the food was bought and where it was delivered. The thickness shows the quantity of food aid. And what you can see is that in '88, most food aid was bought in Canada and delivered elsewhere. Okay. 5 years after untying, this is what the direction and magnitude of food aid looks like. Okay. So this is the most recent year for which I have data for a picture like this, but you can see that just this dramatic change, right? That now no emergency cereal food aid is bought in Canada. The organizations that deliver this food find it in their interest just not to do that, which given what we've just discussed, kind of makes sense. Okay, so that's a dramatic change. And another thing that we were interested in from a research perspective is, there were changes in the speed of delivery, the commodities that were delivered, the procurement locations. But another thing that at the end of the day, what we were really interested in is, did this affect the amount, the quantity of food aid that was provided by Canadian donations? And that's a really hard thing to model. What I've got here, this blue line shows historical food aid shipments, emergency cereal food aid shipments paid for by Canada. And it's a very volatile thing. It responds to a lot of different things in both Canada and in recipient countries. So what we spent a lot of time doing was trying to model this process and get an idea of what determines these changes. And in that model, we had a feature that allowed us to turn off and on this time policy. So we could say, this is what food aid actually looked like. So in 2005, it became untied. And 2006, it went up a bit and then down and then went up. So it's really hard to sort out what was the effect of the policy change. Our model allows us to do that. And so what we did in our model is estimated what would food aid have looked like if it had remained tied. Okay, so I won't go into the modeling process, but what we found and what our model tells us is food aid shipments out of Canada would have looked something more like this red line. Okay, so the difference between the two is the effect of changing this policy. So untying Canadian food aid made an absolutely enormous impact on the quantity of food that Canada delivers as emergency cereal food aid. Just absolutely huge. Okay. So, in this case, what are some interesting lessons to take out of it? Well, by narrowing the focus of this policy tool from subsidizing farmers and buying foreign allies, we've given more food faster, more flexible in the face of trade restrictions, which has been important now in the context of COVID, where there are trade restrictions and other things. I won't talk about WTO today, I don't have time, but what we're hoping is that our work can help shape and inform the policy debate in the US, where most food aid is still tied. And in fact, the US is the largest food aid donor in the world. They donate more food aid than every other country combined. So we're hoping our experience in Canada will be informative there. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a totally different set of policies now, called, in this case, supply management. So I think a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar with what supply management is. It is a set of policies applied to the production and distribution of milk, chicken, and turkey, and eggs in Canada. It has three sort of main components, three pillars is the language typically used. It has a set of production quotas that caps total output of these products in the country and then shares those out between provinces. So if you are a producer of these products, you have to have a license in order to sell your output to a provincial marketing authority. There's also a formula by which farmers are paid, so it's not a market price in the way that ranchers or cereal crop farmers receive. And holding it all together is a set of import restrictions. So basically a very high, I showed you an example earlier, very high, prohibitively high import tariffs on these products that keeps out most of what would otherwise be coming into the country through freer trade. And so, there's very legitimate academic debates about the magnitude of the effects of these policies on outcomes, but sort of there's a broad consensus that some of the big important outcomes of this policy has been smaller farms, smaller dairy and poultry farms in Canada than would otherwise be the case, more stable market incomes than would be the case in other sectors or without supply management, and higher wholesale and retail prices for these products, for dairy products and poultry products. So for the consumer at the grocery store and in the restaurant. Okay, it's an interesting group of policies I use a lot for teaching because it's got all kinds of interesting economics that we can draw pictures for, and it's a very useful tool. It's interesting because it's kind of old-fashioned. Most countries have moved away from these types of policies. Canada still has it, and it's been around for what, 50-ish years now, a little over 50 years. So one of the interesting unintended consequences of supply management is that it has regressive distributional effects. And there are a number of ways that this can be thought of. One is, the group of people who pay for this policy are domestic consumers who pay higher prices than would otherwise be the case. And there are several beneficiaries through the supply chain, but ultimately the targeted beneficiary of this policy are farm households. right? So this is just a figure that shows average household income in Canada in 2019, about $80,000, $90,000. And then dairy farm households and egg and poultry farm households. And you can see on average, the consumers who pay for this policy through higher prices are transferring resources to these groups. So that's one way you can think of the distributional effects. Another way that you can think about the distributional effects and a little bit more of an academic approach that we took in some research was to consider something called Engel's law. So Engel's law explains how as income goes up, household expenditure on food goes up as well, but it goes up slower than income. So the takeaway from that is that high income households spend more on food, but it's a smaller share of their incomes. Okay. So if a government policy then imposes a policy that pushes prices up, that acts as an implicit tax on food. Okay. And because low income households spend a larger share of their incomes on food, that implicit tax is a larger relative burden on them than it is on high income households. Okay. So supply management imposes an implicit tax through higher prices. Okay. So what a research project that I worked on with Chad Lawley, who's in our department, and Di Zhang, who was a PhD student at the time, is we tried to quantify this, right? I showed you those pictures earlier of the GST and the carbon tax, and we were interested in sort of making a comparison. How significant is the degree of regressivity in this case? So put some numbers to this issue. And these are the sort of end of the line results from our paper. And what this shows is that for the poorest fifth of households in Canada, the lowest income, the implicit tax rate is about 2.5% of income. Okay. And for the richest fifth of households, it's about half of 1%. Okay. So you can see it again traces that downward slope. It imposes a relatively larger burden on low income households than on high income households. So this is regressive. How regressive, that's sort of a subjective decision, but more so than those figures I showed you for the GST and for the carbon tax. Okay, so this paper came out in 2015. It really changed a lot of things in my career and in my extension work. The paper was well received. We got a nice prize from the Canadian Economic Association, and it got a lot of press in national and local and producer press. And our social science colleagues thought it was a reasonably well done thing. Of course, as a student, my PhD supervisor prepared me very well, and he would often repeat this quote, "Never underestimate vested interests." And so, of course, we were met with a lot of things like this. So what I've got here are two examples of comments that tried to address our results in various forums. They didn't really contribute to the academic debate or the methodological issues that we were dealing with in the paper. Really, they were just attempts to muddy the water about our results. And actually, keen observers might notice that the names here have appeared on an earlier slide. These two are both funded chairs by a producer group that would have an interest in objecting to these findings that we had in our research. So we expected this kind of stuff. It was not a surprise. It was sort of anticipated. Something that we were not necessarily anticipating and were a little disappointed with was the blowback we were getting from other people in other groups, including in the community that I operate at work and faculty members and our dean's office. And so a lot of blowback, and again, not really methodological issues with what we had done, but more ideological. So Chad and I spent a lot of time dealing with press and interest groups and conversations. And after a lot of these, we really observed that people have very evangelical opinions about specific policies. And so that has led us into this big research project now we've been working on for a number of years. And that is where we're trying to get a better understanding of what shapes individuals' preferences and support for very specific policies. Okay. And so we've done this through a big survey project with an experiment in it and some randomized controlled trials. And one thing we've learned a lot of things. I mean, one thing we've learned is that preferences and support for very specific policies vary. Of course, they vary across people, and they tend to vary and be correlated with people's views on big picture social and economic and political issues. There's a literature like this in other social sciences, like preferences for immigration and tax policies, and we're trying to apply that research and that literature to agricultural policy. And so some of the things we found, I'll just share a few of those with you here. One is that support for specific policies, of course, varies across people's views on big picture issues. So here I've got a figure out of our paper that shows how support for, in this case, SM and supply management, how support for supply management varies across people's voting intentions. So I've highlighted Manitoba. And so what this shows us, this blue square here shows us among the Conservative Party of Canada voters in our experiment, about 50% of them support supply management, 50% oppose. Okay. Among NDP voters, very high support, north of 90%, right? But there's pretty clear separation between voting intentions on support for this policy. Okay. Now, we expect even within those groups there to be some differences on, how you view trade generally and how that affects your opinion on supply management. So here's another example of something that we observed, is that if people view incorrectly, by the way, incorrectly perceive farm household income to be low, farmers to be relatively not well off, they are more supportive of supply management, right? And people who perceive farm income to be high, above average, have lower support for supply management, around 55%, right? So, these perceptions of inequality and liberalizing trade and voting patterns, really, you can observe these distinct separations in support for policy. We've learned that. So some other things we've learned, those are the kinds of things that we can get from a polling company. We were more interested from an academic perspective in understanding what forms these policies and how strongly held are they. So in the context of our survey and our experiment, we provided some information treatments to people and tried to then estimate how responsive are they in their support for this policy to different treatments, different information treatments. So, this is a sort of the big picture takeaway from our paper, is that the control group, so these are people that are just asked their opinion on the policy, supports about 67, 68%. Okay. And then there was a treatment arm that received personalized information on what this policy might cost a household like theirs. So we had this interesting methodology to estimate that and then provide it to them in real time and then ask them. So that pushed support for the policy down, but just by a few points. And then another treatment group received information on the distributional effects that I discussed. So describing that it imposes this regressive tax. What did that do? Well, it pushed support down, but not by very much. Okay. So what we're finding is that support is high and it's pretty strongly held, right? Even if we provide them with information that you might think runs afoul of their underlying views. So this shows the treatment effects of these treatments that I described by voting intention. So again, I've highlighted the one I think is the most interesting here. The NDP typically advocates for progressive social policies, right? Redistributing from high to low income households in various forms. And so what we could test in our experiment is, are NDP voters more sensitive to that distributional information treatment, being told that this policy does sort of the opposite of what a lot of NDP policies advocate for. And interestingly, not really, right? So they move from support of almost 70% down by 1 or 2 points, right? So these opinions and these levels of support for these specific policies are strongly held and not very responsive. So, we've spent a lot of time trying to better understand these results. We've done a number of other things, and we've identified some interesting patterns. For example, low income households, the poorest 10th of households in our sample, are more responsive to being told how much it might cost them compared to high income households. Individuals who identify themselves as being more supportive of increasing support to low income households are a little bit more responsive to being told that it has regressive distributional effects. But, I emphasize showing you all these things. These effects are pretty small relative to the level of support. Okay. And so Chad came up with this great phrase that baked in, right? That what we're observing and what we're arguing is that support for very specific policies is really baked in and based on your sort of big picture worldviews on things like redistribution, inequality, free trade, political party support, et cetera, right? And so people they sort of have these heuristics on which they evaluate a specific policy, and it falls under these categories. And what we're hypothesizing, if this is particularly the case when policies and their effects are hard to understand and non-transparent, which is certainly the case in supply management, right? This is very different from a direct payment to farmers. Okay, it's hard to understand. So this is some work that we're currently doing that is trying to go down the road of what we found in some of our earlier work. So I will try and wrap it up here. I've just got one or two more things to wrap up. So lessons for policies. So given all this work I've done in the years I've been teaching, what I try and do myself and try and teach my students to try and think about is when we're talking about agricultural policy or any policy for that matter, try and identify the single objective that we are targeting. Okay, so is it to increase farmer income or stabilize farmer income? And those are different things, right? That require different policy tools. Or is it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And stay away from, we're going to target 5 things with this one policy, right? So sort of the opposite of killing 3 birds with one stone. Because what we find is if you do that, you will do a bad job of hitting all those targets, and or you will do so at very high cost with a lot of unintended consequences. Okay, so once we've done that, design the policy tool or tools to target that objective. Okay, and so this is sort of called the Tinbergen rule in economics. Jan Tinbergen was an economist. I think this is a picture of him on the phone being told that he won the Nobel Prize. So this is something that I really try and teach my students. And then once we've done that, understand the mechanisms, the institutions involved here. So important is identifying the trade-offs. There will almost always be trade-offs, winners and losers. This is a book I use with my grad student, Dealing with Losers. And the key message is in almost any policy that we talk about, there will be both winners and losers. And I read all these documents coming out of consultant groups and government reports that say, well, this would be great for Canada or win-win. That, that's just not the case. And it is my opinion that we do a real disservice to serious policy debate by pretending otherwise. Okay, so be aware of rent seekers, existing and potential future, and these unintended consequences, which in some case can be so large that we should maybe consider changing course on policy. And then, of course, we need to be able to quantify them, which is what I spend most of my time doing, and then hopefully translate that into information that can be used and helpful for policymakers, so they can make informed policy choices. Okay, so just to end, I do want to try and end on an optimistic note and on a good note. We can, and in fact we have, improved policy over time. So I showed you this picture already. This change in Canadian food aid policy is absolutely unprecedented in my view. I struggle to think of a development policy that has had a bigger impact than this. So this can be done, right? And I showed you this picture as well, the GST picture. What I didn't show you originally was the yellow line, which shows the net GST by income decile after accounting for GST rebates or GST credits. So low-income households get some of that money refunded, which in this case turns the curve around, bends it the other way and makes it progressive. Okay. Likewise, carbon taxes, we can do similar things, right? The purple line shows without rebates, but most jurisdictions provide some form of a recycling and a payback of a carbon dividend paid according to household income, right? So you can turn that curve around or flatten it out with different tools. So these things can be done and are being done in many policy arenas. So there's hope, and what my hope is to apply these tools and improve some of the policies that we face now. So with that, I will rack it up. There's some references if anyone's interested, and there's the cover page. So I'm finished there, Derek, and happy to take questions.
Our first question comes from Jonathan Rossett, who I was trying to see if he wanted to ask it in person, and I didn't get a note. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the difference between the untied, observed, and tied model seems incredibly excessive, and what went into the model seems to be a bit of a black box. Can you go a bit into detail what would have led to a tied model of emergency aid to estimate that Canada would have provided so much less than the untied policy? Well, you're muted there, Ryan.
Yeah, so can I go into the model? I don't want to go into the model and put a bunch of equations on the screen. What I could do, I guess, if this would be useful, let me go back to my slide for this picture. It's an econometric statistical model that we worked on for a long time using data from the World Food Program. And so that, if you're familiar with kind of modeling, the left-hand side variable is the amount of food aid, and the right-hand side variable are variables that explain changes in that amount of food aid. So it includes things like Canada's aid budget. It includes the occurrence of natural disasters in recipient countries, civil conflicts, displaced persons, distance between the countries, all these things. If you're really interested, I'm happy to share the paper with you. You can really dig into it. But what we do is this blue line is the observed data. The gray line is the predicted value or quantity of food aid that comes out of our model, right? So this, the distance between the gray and the blue line is sort of the measure, a very rough estimate of the goodness of fit, how well our model would predict the actual levels of food aid. And then within that model, we have econometric tools to identify the effects of the policy change using what we call dummy variables. And we can turn those off and on. So we turn it off at this period where the policy change occurred, and that then simulates what food aid would have looked like given all the other conditions we observed, droughts and floods and civil conflicts and changing commercial ties between donor and recipient country. And that gives us this gray line, but when we turn off the tying, it gives us this red line, right? So it is a statistical estimate based on, what we think was a fairly credible modeling exercise. Okay, so that's how we arrive at that. And if you're interested in the details of the model, you can send me an email. I'm happy to share the paper with you.
I think just looking at that graph, there was a huge increase in prices in 2008 that had stuck around. And so if we had a fixed budget, that would have dropped the amount they could have bought.
Yes.
That simple fact would have covered
the budget, the aid budget allocated to food aid was one of the right-hand side variables in that. So we control for that, right? We control for, the objective of a model like that is to control for everything else except the change in policy, right? So all we're left with that's changing, that's different between the red and the blue line is the policy, right? So the weather's the same, the commercial ties are the same, the budget's the same, et cetera.
Yeah, there are questions in the queue, but I do have kind of one that's been burning with me, and I apologize. Ryan and I have a history of me making him uncomfortable with my questions, but I'll try to be gentle here. But my question is, and I see the impact of lobbying everywhere and a lot in the US, and I'm just a little bit afraid of, is there any way we can have a democracy where we do have people that are getting reelected, where lobbying and rent seeking isn't kind of part of the politics?
No. So that's my short answer. I mean, an optimistic response to that might be, we are certainly in a better situation than the United States is, right? So, I'm not a political scientist, but my understanding of these processes is that this kind of lobbying is much more prevalent and successful in the United States because of the different form of government, right? So in the Canadian system, party discipline on any specific issue is so important that the sort of whining and dining form of lobbying is just much less effective, because you're not going to convince a liberal voter to vote against an agricultural policy that their leader tells them to vote for, right? So I think there is, the optimistic side of the story is that in Canada, I think we are in a better situation than in other countries. But there is, the phrase lobbying usually takes on a negative connotation for good reason. But to be fair, I mean, the change in food aid policy started with a lobbying campaign by the Canadian Food Grains Bank, right? And so lobbying can take many different forms.
Well, and it
is an important part of any democracy, in my opinion.
But it did happen at a sort of a stress point. And I wonder if, climate change and a stress point, say a long-term drought here, where the budget for agriculture had to go in a bunch of different ways if we wouldn't get quite focused on how do we design a true income stabilization system rather than an income system. I wonder if a threat can actually help shift the policy.
Sure. Yes, I'm sure it could.
Okay, we do have a question. I think we should unmute James Rood so that you can have a quick talk to him.
Okay.
Are you okay with that, James? Teddy, can we unmute James Rood?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So you've given two examples of cases where you look at the effect of policies given an income distribution of households. Have ag economists and economists in general have they dropped the ball by not looking at more broad things like, most of the money goes into income support, agri-stability, agri-invest, agri-insure. Is there a large gap there, or is it not worth looking at?
So sorry, James, I'm not sure is the question. So most of the money goes
if you're looking at the impact of agri-stability, should you be looking at the distributional impacts, I guess, across producers, but across producers and consumers?
Well, I mean, my immediate response to that, given my preferences on research, would be yes, right? I mean, so agri-stability, again, it's another policy that has several objectives, right? It's a stabilization tool, but it's also heavily subsidized, so it increases incomes. But there are important distributional concerns, right, among size and income levels of farm. But of course, my research on the supply management side was just outside of producers. What's the effect on the people who are paying for it? So the taxpayers who are paying for the subsidized margin insurance, are they relatively better or worse off than the beneficiaries of the program whose income is to be subsidized? So I haven't done any of that, but I would say that I would be very happy to see that kind of research done, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Rood. Nice to hear your voice. Take care.
Yes.
And we do have an anonymous attendee asking, did you ask survey participants if or how they considered perceived effects on health or environment in their support or lack of for supply management? Or was the focus exclusively on regressive effects?
No, the focus was not exclusively on that. And it was a very large survey, and we have a lot of information about the respondents' views on things. We have a whole battery of questions on things like animal welfare, food safety, support for other types of government policies, national defense, environmental policy. So we do have a whole battery of information on our respondents that are factored into our econometric model. The outcomes of interest that I've reported to you are related to those. The outcome of interest in our model is support for the policy. And our treatments, the information treatments that we were provided, were related to the distributional effects and the cost effects. But we do know from the survey a lot of information about these people and how they perceive those exact issues you've asked about.
We have a question from Nazem Sisik, who's our Associate Dean of Research. Have there been unintended consequences to Canadian farmers as a result of untying the food aid in 2005? For example, has there been an effect on residual food or food waste?
On food or food waste? I haven't studied that. My guess would be no, or so close to little that the answer would be no. The food that was being, well, I suppose it's certainly possible, and this still actually existed, and it happened a little bit at the beginning of the pandemic. Some producer groups that were faced with an inability to send their products down the supply chain because restaurants closing, et cetera, were donating, for example, surpluses to local food banks, right? So I guess in my mind, I wouldn't call that an unintended consequence because the policy was actually removed. So, my response to that, if you're worried about food waste, which is a perfectly legitimate policy objective to target, using food aid to address it is a very, very bad, inefficient way to do it, right? So there might have been measurable effects on waste of, some protein sources or maybe some wheat that would have been produced in Canada and otherwise shipped as food aid. But I would guess the world had changed so much that I imagine anything like that would be so small, very, very small.
And our next question would like to be in person, Teddy, Alan Dawson, who I believe has asked the question to every one of our Kraft Lecture presenters. Welcome, Alan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My question is perhaps partly out of your scope, Dr. Cardwell, but first off, I was wondering if dealing with poorer people that are, paying a greater portion of their income on food due to supply and management, if a rebate would work as it does with GST or carbon tax. And then the second part, I'd like you to address, if you could, if it's not too far out of scope. But often when we look at supply management in Canada and people point out the problems with the higher costs, especially for lower income people, we look at the United States and we see supposedly an open market, but we know that it's highly subsidized. And so I'm wondering, if we were to compare our two systems in terms of the impact on farmers and on consumers, would the US system be that much better than ours?
Okay, so I will take both of those questions. So would a rebate to low-income consumers undo some of the regressive effects? So, mechanically, I suppose, there could be a mechanism that we could design that, had consumers report to government how much they spent on this, that, and the other product, and we design a rebate around that, or just a lump sum based on their income level. So mechanically that could work, but that doing so, in my view, completely misses the point of what I was trying to say in the lecture, which is if we have a policy objective, and in supply management, I don't know, is that to stabilize income or is it to increase income? Identify that objective and target it with the best tools we can. Okay. Instead of building a very complicated thing that creates a lot of unintended consequences, inefficiently maybe achieves that objective, and then we need to add on these other things like a rebate. A carbon tax, I think a good comparison here is a carbon tax. A carbon tax, by almost any measure, is the most efficient way that we can come up with to target greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the policy to pursue. It creates unintended consequences, right? So we can address those with a rebate. If our target or our objective is dairy farm income, there are a lot simpler, more direct ways that we can achieve that than through production controls, import controls, interprovincial trade barriers, cost of production pricing, and then adding on top of that a bunch of other stuff to undo the unintended consequences. Okay, so mechanically, yes, we could do it, I guess, but that would just make a very complicated way to address a policy objective even more complicated unnecessarily. And then your second question was about a comparison between the US and the Canadian dairy markets. So I don't think I would know too many economists who would describe the US dairy market as, I'm not sure if you use the word competitive or open, but it's highly distorted by a lot of government policies in very different ways, right? So dairy farmers in the US receive very high levels of support from government, but most of that support comes from taxpayers, not from consumers, right? There's a lot of the same people, but it's a different mechanism, right? So the producers in the US receive money from taxpayers raised largely through a progressive income tax, whereas in Canada, the producers receive support in the form of higher prices directly from consumers, which is a regressive policy. So yeah, certainly it's not an open market. It's not a free market without government intervention, and it operates in a very different way. And I'm not going to take a position on which one is better or worse. They're very different with different consequences and different effects.
Thanks everybody. And I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask this last question, partly because I'm one of the guys that pushed back against Ryan in the past about supply management. And I just want to say, I don't think there's actually very much disagreement within our discipline that quota value shouldn't continue to increase. I think, that's a slowly building liability, but there has been discussions about removing supply management that might have its own unintended consequences, Ryan, right? Like you talk about dismantling a system that has been running for a long time where the entire supply chain is used to a certain type of contract. And you say, well, we should, that seems to be a big imposition. But if we just started to lower milk prices to map and to target lowering quota values, we're reducing the federal government liability right away, and we're reducing the cost to the consumer right away, rather than it'd be a fairly costly thing to dismantle supply management now, right?
Yes, I'm not sure what the question is there, but
No,
yes, it would be
would
costly
have-
if the government decided to compensate the value of lost quota. It would be very expensive. And actually, our grad student is defending his proposal on Friday. That is the exact topic of his thesis. But I wouldn't advise using the phrase unintended consequences for the absence of a policy, right? So the unintended consequences usually are used in the context of describing you put in place a policy it creates. By taking them away, you aren't creating unintended consequences. You are, going back to how the market would have been without that policy. So it's just it's a terminology thing. But yeah, certainly it would be very costly.
Let's just as an example, if we did that and we lost the whole sector and then we had to import everything, the cost of milk and egg might not be any different to. I'm not saying that's a likely scenario, but there could be that unintended consequence of a dismantling. I think it's feasible. No.
No, I would disagree with that. Anyways, why don't we move on?
Okay, I'm sorry that we ended on a disagreement. Thank you everyone very much for coming. I really appreciate, especially to you, Ryan, for this thought-provoking presentation and discussion. Thank you to all of our attendees and to our question askers. A special thanks to the individuals who organized the lecture, including Surinder Cambos, Crystal Jorgensen, Dr. Brian Olson, Josh and Teddy, who were in our control room, and most important to Myrna and Dan Kraft, whose generosity in fundraising has made all of this possible. And we welcome our get-togethers when we're in person. That winds up our Kraft Lecture for this year. Thank you and best wishes for a great 2022.
Thanks, everyone.